Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the Fielding Center and for its final event of the fall semester. We have a bit of a treat for you this evening. Tonight, we have the honor of welcoming one of the preeminent political thinkers and public intellectuals of our time to speak with you all. During the event, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you're taking part in the live in-person watch event, you can hand your questions to a member of the Eisenhower Institute, and that question will get relayed to us. Here to introduce this evening's guest is Nicole DiGiacomo, a Fielding Fellow and a member of the class of 2022.
George F. Will's newspaper column has been syndicated by the Washington Post since 1974. Today, it appears twice weekly in more than 440 newspapers. In 1976, he became a regular contributing editor of the Newsweek magazine, for which he provided a bi-monthly essay until 2011. And in 1997, he won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary in his newspaper columns. In 1981, Mr. Will became a founding panel member on ABC television's This Week and spent over 3 decades providing regular commentary. Then followed 3 years at Fox News, where he appeared regularly on the Special Report and Fox News Sunday. Altogether, 8 collections of Mr. Will's Newsweek and Washington Post columns have been published. Mr. Will has also published several books on political theory and baseball. Mr. Will's 16th book, American Happiness and Discontents, The Unruly Torrent, from 2008 to 2020, was published in September, and in 2019, Mr. Will released the Conservative Sensibility, the basis for his talk tonight. Please join me in welcoming this evening, Mr. George Will.
Good evening, and I want to say it's a great pleasure for me to be in Gettysburg, if only virtually, for several reasons. My father's father was a Lutheran minister who attended Gettysburg Seminary, and every day I benefit all day long from a Gettysburg education. That of my assistant, Alexis Sechrist, of the class of 2020. I've had a great many assistants, research assistants in my last 35 years or so, and I can honestly say she's the best so far. So thank you, Gettysburg College. I am a lapsed professor and a child of academia. My father was a professor of philosophy at the University of Illinois, and I briefly was a professor. When I left Oxford, I had to choose between going to law school and going to Princeton in the philosophy department to get a PhD, which I eventually did. I don't quite remember, it's a long time ago, I think I chose Princeton over law school because Princeton was midway between 2 National League baseball cities, Philadelphia and New York. Be that as it may, I'm a lapsed professor, but still, I think, practicing political philosophy, and that is what I want to talk with you about today. The fundamental question posed to conservatives fairly is, what do you want to conserve? The answer from this conservative, from American conservatives, and as I will make clear that in the phrase American conservatism, the adjective American does a lot of work. We'll get to that in a moment. But basically what we want to conserve is the American founding, its principles and its implications, institutionally, implications in government and in the economic institutions of a pluralist, voluntary, spontaneous order, open society. The principles, it seems to me, of our market society are as follows. First, there is such a thing as human nature. That is constant over time. We are not simply creatures that acquire the impression of whatever social promptings from the culture we are immersed in. Second, therefore, there are natural rights, that is, rights that are essential to the flourishing of creatures with our natures. Third, from this it follows that we need a madisonian structure of government, by which I mean the following. We need a government strong enough to protect our rights, but not too strong to threaten our rights. We need a government that does what the Declaration of Independence said. The Declaration said, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and governments are instituted to secure those rights, not to give us our rights. First come rights and then comes government in the American understanding. We are students, we conservatives, of the Madisonian Revolution in politics, in democratic theory. Prior to Madison, those who believed, and there weren't that many, who believed that democracy would be possible or a good idea, all seemed to share the belief that a democracy had to be a small face-to-face society, something like Pericles' Athens or Rousseau's Geneva, something you could walk across in a day, because it was then assumed that factions, disparate factions, were the enemy of democracy. And that therefore, in order to have a democracy, you needed to have a small, homogeneous polity. Madison came along and said, that's exactly backwards. If you read Federalist 10 and 51, and I hope Gettysburg has required you to read Federalist 10 and 51 somewhere along the way. In Federalist 10, Madison said, no, what we want is an extensive republic. The larger, the better. Because he said government will, in its first primary function, protect the different and unequal capacities of acquiring property. This will mean a plethora, a saving multiplicity of factions. We want many factions because they had this following catechism, the founders did. What is the worst outcome of politics? Tyranny. To what form of tyranny is democracy prey? Tyranny of the majority. Therefore, don't have majorities. Actually, it meant don't have stable tyrannical majorities. Have only majorities that are shifting, unstable, evanescent alliances between many factions. That way you will avoid tyranny of the majority. Therefore, an extensive republic with many factions would be the safest form of democracy. And in Federalist 51, he said, you will see throughout our institutions of the federal government the process of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives. That is, we want to have people with good motives in politics, but we're not going to count on it. We want a system that will work even when many people have self-interested, narrow or factional motives. Therefore, we want to have a system of rivals. We want the Senate to be the rival of the House. We want the legislative branch to be the rival of the executive branch. This idea that we should have teams came along later, shortly thereafter of the founding and the writing of the Constitution. Something happened in the 1790s that the framers of the Constitution neither expected nor desired. That was the emergence of a party system. And the Madisonian presumption of rivalrous institutions in a kind of equilibrium has been somewhat undermined by the superiority, in many cases, of party loyalty over institutional pride, dignity, and loyalty. That's too bad, but that is a fact. In the phrase American conservatism, as I say, the adjective American is terribly important. Conservatism really was born in Europe as an articulate, self-conscious persuasion, through Edmund Burke principally, in reaction to the French Revolution. And it was therefore inherently preoccupied with stability and hierarchy, and came out of Europe somewhat tainted, in my judgment, by throne and altar, blood and soil understanding of conservatism. But when conservatism crossed the Atlantic, it became very different. It has been said that the story of the Bible, reduced to one sentence, is God created man and woman and promptly lost control of events. Conservatives like that. Conservatives don't want controlled society. They want a society with the fecundity of freedom, with the creativity of a spontaneous order of an open, fluctuating, fluid society. And this is what we've got. Now, the first president to criticize the American founding and to set the stage really for the argument we're having today in the United States between progressives and conservatives was, I regret to say, as a Princeton PhD, Princeton's Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson did not just criticize the founding peripherally, but root and branch. He said the whole structure, the separation of powers was all right once when we were a small country with 4 million people living, 80% of them living within 20 miles of Atlantic tidewater. But now, he said, we're a complex society, continental in scope, united by steel rails and copper wire, and we need a more efficient and nimble government, a government wielded by a president who's not tied down like Gulliver among the Lilliputians with lots of threads of obligations to the other branches of government. This is, it seems to me, the great progressive non sequitur, which was that as society gets more complicated, government must get more complicated and interventionist. The fact is, as I shall recur to in a moment, that's a non sequitur, because the more complicated society gets, the less there is that government can know about what it's interfering with in a complicated society, and therefore should be more humble in its approach. But what this meant was the progressives decided that, in fact, there is no such thing as human nature, that we are indeed mere products of our culture. And this meant that consciousness itself became a political project, opening the way for many of the excesses of politics in the 20th century. And furthermore, when they denied natural rights, which you do when you deny that there's a fixed human nature, the progressives gave birth to the idea of rights as grants of autonomy, spaces of autonomy granted by the majority and revocable by the majority. So it was a less secure grounding for rights being, in my judgment, the basis of American political philosophy. Now, it's important to understand that Woodrow Wilson was a product of his time, and his time was one saturated by respect for science, which was in the air, literally in the air. The Wright brothers, Marconi, Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, a belief that science was flourishing everywhere and could flourish in political science. Woodrow Wilson was, before he was president of the United States, he was president of the fledgling American Political Science Association and one of the pioneers of the science, as they thought of it, of public administration. The problem is when you begin to think that politics is a science, you begin to feel that dissent is illegitimate somehow, neglecting what the man who became my very best friend in Washington had to say. I'm referring to Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was for 4 terms was a senator from New York, former professor at Harvard. Pat was almost certainly the most accomplished social scientist ever to serve in the legislative branch of our government. And he never tired of telling his colleagues, social science can't tell us what to do. Social science can tell us the results of what we're doing. And in fact, Pat and Daniel Bell and Nathan Glazer and James Q. Wilson and a whole lot of other distinguished public intellectuals in the 1960s and 70s offered a comprehensive critique of the results of the Great Society programs that became the intellectual foundation of conservatism in the last 50 years. So it seems to me quite important for people to understand that society in its complexity, it's an appreciation of complexity that leads to the conservative warning against the fatal conceit. The fatal conceit is a phrase from Friedrich Hayek, whose Road to Serfdom, followed by the Constitution of Liberty, or some of the canonical texts of post-war conservatism in the United States. Hayek said the fatal conceit is the belief that government can know more than it actually can know about the complexities of a modern market capitalist society. The fatal conceit leads to a government that does not have epistemic humility, another one of Hayek's phrases. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that determines how we know things and what we can know. What is the foundation of knowledge? Epistemic humility in government is where government says there's so many things we can't know. This is so complex that modern society is like a Calder mobile. When you touch it here, things jiggle way over there. And therefore government ought to be careful about its interventions. And this leads to and is affirmed by the capitalism we have, the market society, which is, I think, essential to, indispensable to an open society in which markets, rather than political decisions, rather than government power, primarily allocate wealth and opportunity. Obviously, that's a mixture in our society. Government will allocate wealth and opportunity somewhat, but markets will, I think, when we're healthy, allocate more so. There are three basic reasons for favoring a market society, a capitalist society. First is it works. Almost all the economic growth, the human betterment in material terms in the history of the human race has occurred in the last 250 years as a result of ideas that first flourished in Holland and then crossed the English Channel and gained steam, literally steam, from Mr. Watt's steam engine. When economic growth began. Economic growth for the first 10,000 years since the invention of agriculture until the invention of the steam engine was well, the human race lived in 95% or more lived in squalor and disease until economic growth began, driven by what we call capitalism. Second, capitalism does not just work, but it makes us not just better off, which it manifestly does, it makes us better. Capitalism requires a society of trust, contracts, promise keeping. It requires politeness. Walk into any store in downtown Gettysburg, and the first words you're apt to hear are, "How may I help you?" It's a society of again, as I say, politeness and spontaneous order. But another reason for capitalism, and a political reason, is about the political culture. If the government supplants the spontaneous order of a market society in allocating wealth and opportunity, the stakes of politics become unhealthily high, and you set yourself up for bitter distributional conflicts in politics, because politics becomes just too important. Elections become just too important because they will determine who rises and who falls, and again, where wealth and opportunity are going to be distributed. If I could ask every undergraduate in the United States to read one thing, in addition to, of course, the great works of de Tocqueville and the Federalist Papers and all the rest, I would have them read a small essay by Lawrence Reed called I, Pencil. The thesis of it is, no one can make a pencil. What he meant was no one can make a pencil. First, you start with the graphite that has to be mined in Southeast Asia, a lot of it, and shipped. People have to do the mining, people have to do the shipping, people have to build the ships to have the shipping. Then, of course, there's the wood on those nice yellow pencils. The trees have to be grown and harvested and sent to lumber mills. And then you have to get the wood and the graphite together. You have to have some rubber for the little nice pink eraser at the top of it. You need some yellow paint for those nice yellow pencils. Long story short, to make a pencil requires literally millions of people. No one person can do it. And if we counted on government to organize all this, we'd not have any pencils. This is part of capitalism making us better as well as better off, requires us to cooperate and to think and to respect spontaneous order. There's a wonderful passage in de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where de Tocqueville in the early 1830s, in the age of Jackson, is floating down the Ohio River. On his left is slaveholding Kentucky, where there's a kind of sleepiness, an absence of the crackling energy of a free society, because they did not depend on free labor. On the other side, on the Ohio bank of the river, there was that crackling energy, that sense of commotion and bustle that comes with a market society. So it seems to me that I was right 40 years ago when I gave the Godkin lectures at Harvard, which became a book called Statecraft is Soulcraft. The subtitle of my book was not what government should do, but what government does, what government cannot help but do. I said government, by whatever economic arrangements it provides the legal and jurisprudential basis for, it will have an effect on the souls of the people. You'll get a certain kind of person will be encouraged, certain character traits will be encouraged. And I think capitalism, as I understand it, does indeed produce a kind of energetic, trusting, cooperative individual that makes for a free society and a democratic culture. Respecting particularly markets as what markets really are, which are information generating devices and cooperation inducing devices, such as those that would produce a pencil. Now, I know some of you are saying, yes, but capitalism results in inequality, to which I say, yeah, and that's a good thing. Here's what I mean by that. If you say yes to liberty, you are necessarily saying yes to inequality in outcomes. This is nothing wrong with that. The great poet Robert Frost once said, I do not want to live in a homogenized society. I want the cream to rise. And the cream rises when you allow scope for different attitudes and different aptitudes. People want to teach kindergarten. Some people want to run hedge funds. Some people want to be commandant of the Marine Corps, bless them all. But there's going to be different outcomes as different attitudes and aptitudes are rewarded in different ways by society determining by market mechanisms how compensation should be allocated. Now, some people say, well, that sounds like elitism. Again, I plead guilty, absolutely guilty. And I would warn those of you who are listening to us in this webinar at Gettysburg College, and you're saying you're anti-elitist, well, you better go back to your dorm, pack up and go home, because when you leave Gettysburg with a college degree, you are going to be part of America's elite. Get over it. This is why we have institutions like Gettysburg College, which is to produce the cream that we want to rise in Robert Frost's understanding of things. People who find inequality of social outcomes embittering to them and annoying are, I think, often surrendering to envy, which is one of the least attractive emotions in modern life. Envy, it has been well said, is the only one of the 7 deadly sins that doesn't give the sinner even momentary pleasure. I should pause here, I suppose, and let all of you go down the list, but it's true. To criticize and resent success in a market society, it seems to me, and this is something conservatives preach tirelessly, is to succumb to a kind of curdling, toxic resentment of success. Mark Twain, who could be a great scourge of the elites and the rich. He gave the name to the Gilded Age. It was the title of one of his less successful novels, but one of his best friends was a hugely successful executive of Standard Oil, which was the great Satan of its day. And a journalist once went up to Twain and said, Mr. Twain, don't you think your friend's wealth is tainted? Twain said, you're damn right, it's doubly tainted. It taint yours and it taint mine. Good conservative impulse there. Today, we're, of course, having a big argument about whether the rich are paying their fair share. I would only point out that the top 1% of American income earners pay 39% of the income tax. The top 5% pay 60%. The top 10% pay 70% of the income tax. And the bottom 50% of American income earners pay less than 3% of the income tax. I don't quite know how you'd make it more progressive than that. There's a story told, it might be apocryphal, but it's lovely and it's lesson anyway, that a socialist once went to Andrew Carnegie over there in Pittsburgh and said, you should distribute your wealth to the people of the world. Well, Carnegie said to an assistant, how many people are there in the world? And the assistant told him, and Carnegie said, well, what is my wealth and my net worth? And assistant told him, And Carnegie then divided the one by the other and handed the socialist in his office 16 cents. He said, there's your share of my wealth. It turns out, in fact, that wealth sort of helps. It helps us to produce steel, that produced the rails, that produced the unity of our country after the Civil War. A lot of it came from, as you know, from Pittsburgh, from the coal mines in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. But as we argue about inequality, and as conservatives contribute to this argument, it's important, conservatives say, to understand this. 200 years ago, the great source of wealth in America was land. We had so much of it, we were giving it away. 150 years ago, the great source of wealth in the United States was heavy fixed capital. Think of Andrew Carnegie's steel mills or Cornelius Vanderbilt's New York Central Railroad. Today, increasingly, the great source of wealth is mind, information, what we call human capital. We have an increasingly cognitively stratified society. Large rewards go to people who know things, who have skills, mental skills, of the kind that, by the way, you people are at Gettysburg College to acquire. Now, this should not obscure the fact that there are certain inherently egalitarian features of modern society. Everyone listening, engaging in this webinar tonight, has the same access to the internet as Bill Gates has. Everyone has the same access to one of the great, maybe the greatest benefit of the 20th century, antibiotics and pharmacology, as Jeff Bezos does. Everyone watching has as good a cell phone, a smartphone, which is an enormously powerful computer in your pocket, as Warren Buffett has. Now, Warren Buffett's a friend of mine, and last time I saw him, he still had a flip phone. So probably everyone watching tonight has a better phone than Warren Buffett. You can take from that such an advantage as you want. Now, conservatives understand that equality of opportunity is an elusive thing to define and a difficult thing to achieve. You can never achieve perfect equality of opportunity. Partly because, and here conservatives understand the foundational function of the family in our society. Family advantages are real. Families are diligent at transmitting their advantages to their children, and we want them to do that. That's, again, why students are at fine schools such as Gettysburg College. And this is why we're having we're tiptoeing around a great problem in the United States. We've been arguing for the last year or so, having what is called a racial reckoning in the United States. And I'm going to tiptoe onto the dark and bloody ground of a controversy that most people have tried to avoid during this. In 1965, the man who would become my best friend, Pat Moynihan, was then a 38-year-old social scientist in Lyndon Johnson's Labor Department. He produced a report, and he knew the report was going to be social dynamite. He caused only 100 copies to be printed, and remarkably, it didn't leak until 6 months later. This was the Moynihan report titled, "The Negro Family, the Case for National Action." He said, we have a national crisis in the United States because 23.7% of African-American children are born to unmarried women. 23.7%. Today it's 69%. And this is not just an African-American problem anymore. 40% of all American first births, regardless of race, color, creed, or national origin, 40% of all first births are to unmarried women. And note this, a majority of mothers under 30 of all races, colors, and creeds are not living with the fathers of their children. Now, this matters. When Pat Moynihan released this report, he made a statement. He said, "The lesson of history is clear," said Irishman Pat Moynihan, "from the wild Irish slums of the East Coast in the 19th century to South Los Angeles today, when you have a large cohort, particularly of young adolescent males You do not have fathers in the home, you have chaos. You have chaotic neighborhoods, you have schools too busy trying to maintain discipline to teach. As a father, I have raised 3 boys. I know that the whole point of civilization is to civilize adolescent males. Without that, there is no civilization. So this is a tremendous problem, and it feeds into the problem of inequality. Now, there is loose in America today, recently, in the last few years, the most radical and, in my view, one of the most pernicious ideas to be let loose in our society in a very long time, and it goes under the name, the anodyne name of equity. We're told we don't want equality of opportunity anymore, that's a chimera, that what we really want is equity, understood in the following way. Equity does not exist when there are disparities of outcome. Any disparity of outcome, say those who are talking about equity, any disparity of social outcome in college graduation rates, in wealth acquisition, all the rest, is presumptively the result of systemic bias and systemic racism. What this means is all that we have put in place to try and achieve a meritocracy, from standardized tests, the SAT tests and all that, to give objective measurements of excellence and potential, to put people on the way to cognitive success in our society. Any disparate outcomes are presumptively illegitimate. This winds up subsuming individuals and dissolving individualism into group memberships, into races or ethnic groups or others, denying particular individual human agency, which conservatives stress over and over again, that we don't want to dissolve individualism and to sink people into mere group identities. And this gives rise not just to the revolt against elitism, but to a kind of populism. You want to know what conservatism is? It's everything populism isn't. Populism says people know exactly what they want and they should get it directly. None of this mediating and refining public opinion through representative institutions that slow down the process and give it time to mature. No, that's not what populism wants. A strong executive, a charismatic president, freed from, again, the separation of powers and its limitations, to translate directly into public policy the passions of the people. That's populism. That is unconservatism. Well, it's the reverse of conservatism, which brings me to something I will share with you. I've been in Washington for 52 years. I've been writing a column. This is my 49th year writing columns. People frequently ask me, have you changed your mind about something? I say, oh, yes, indeed, I have. When I came to Washington in 1970, I had, as most conservatives had then, a disposition to oppose judicial activism, in recoil against some of the more freewheeling creations of unenumerated rights by the Warren Court in the 1950s and 1960s. Well, I was wrong. I don't want a passive judiciary. I don't want a judiciary that defers as a matter of principle to the popular branches of government. Now, let me wax autobiographical for a moment here. I was born and raised in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, Lincoln Country, central Illinois. According to local lore, it was in the Champaign County Courthouse that Abraham Lincoln, at the time a prosperous traveling railroad lawyer, learned that Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas had succeeded in passing through the Congress of the United States the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That act was written to solve a problem. The question that was tearing the country apart was, what do we do about the status of slavery in the territories that were not yet organized into states and therefore were administered by the federal government? Should slavery be permitted there? Should people be allowed to take slaves into the territory? Would territorial law support property in slaves? Stephen A. Douglas's answer was popular sovereignty. He said, let's vote on it. The people of Kansas, Nebraska, and the other territories can vote slavery up. They can vote slavery down. It's a matter of moral indifference. The morally important point, said Stephen Douglas, was that majorities rule. Lincoln's ascent to greatness began with his ferocious recoil against this idea. Lincoln said, no, America is not about a process majority rule. America is about a condition, liberty. And we do not celebrate majority rule to the extent that it can threaten liberty. Let me give you an example of how this translates for this conservative. In 1939, a case went to the Supreme Court from the great state of Pennsylvania. It was called Minersville v. Gobitis. The Gobitis family were Jehovah's Witnesses, and their children refused to comply with the state law of Pennsylvania at that time, requiring students to salute the flag at the beginning of every school day. As Jehovah's Witnesses, they considered this blasphemous. Went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled 8-1. It ruled within days of the German, in 1940, of the German army occupying Paris, that Pennsylvania's majority could require the minority of students who dislike this to salute the flag. The opinion was written by a Jewish immigrant from Austria, Felix Frankfurter, a very distinguished law professor at Harvard before going on to court. And Frankfurter had been a child, a Jewish child in Vienna, and he had seen the horror, as he understood it rightly, of children being treated differently in school because of their religion, and he didn't want it in the United States. And besides, war clouds were lowering over the world, and national unity was considered an important government value. So the court ruled 8-1 that in fact the minority could be forced to conform to the wishes of the majority in this case. Just 3 years later, in a case called West Virginia v. Barnett, same issue, Jehovah's Witnesses came to the court, and the court reversed itself. During wartime, it said, national unity is important, but not more important than individual rights and respect for individual conscience. Robert Jackson, who would go on, Justice Jackson, who would go on to be the lead American jurist at the war crimes trials in Nuremberg after the war, wrote the opinion, and he said, the very purpose of a Bill of Rights is to place certain things beyond the reach of majorities, above and insulated from the vicissitudes of politics. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a great majoritarian jurist and therefore a great advocate of deference to the legislative branches, once said, if the American people want to go to hell, I will help them. It's my job. Well, I think that's wrong. I think the job of the judiciary is to supervise the excesses of democracy, which means in many cases the excesses of majorities. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, the right of the dominant forces of the community to dominate is the essence of democracy. Well, I disagree. I think respect for individual rights, and conservatives believe this, is very much a part of this. I think it's terribly important, therefore, that we begin to understand some of the problems today, as conservatives see them, as problems of runaway majorities. Let me give you an example. Much is said today about the discord in American politics, and Lord knows the discord is real enough, but I am much more alarmed by a consensus. It's as broad as the Republic, it's as deep as the Grand Canyon. It runs across the political spectrum from Elizabeth Warren on the left to Ted Cruz on the right, and it is this, that we should have a large, ever more generous welfare state and not pay for it. That's it. We should give the American people $1 worth of government and charge them 75 cents for it, fobbing off a quarter of the cost of today's government on the unconsenting, because unborn future generations. I should thank you students at Gettysburg, because you're going to pay as you age for my generation's government goods and services. We used to borrow money in government for the future. We fought wars for the future, built roads, harbors, airports, bridges, tunnels for the future. Now we're borrowing from the future, saddling them with debt to fund our own current consumption of government goods and services. If that isn't decadent and immoral, I don't know what is, but that's the way we do it. Because the political class, which I think is more united by class interest than it is divided by ideology, the political class has a permanent interest in running these large deficits because the Lord knows the voters like it. We'll give you these things. We won't charge you their full cost. Everyone's happy. People get reelected and on it spins and up goes the debt and on go the burdens to future generations. Today, we see this in the current administration's plan to spend in trillion-dollar tranches. And they say, well, don't worry because you're not going to have to pay for it. It's all going to be paid for, A, by an unpopular minority, the wealthy, people making more than $400,000 a year, according to the president. That means 98.2% of the country is excluded from the burden of paying for these programs, and corporations. Now, the current administration is committed to the fiction that corporations pay taxes, which I don't think they do. I think corporations collect taxes. There's only three things a corporation can do with corporate taxation. It can pass it along to customers as a cost of doing business. It can take it out of shareholders' dividends, which means take it out of ordinary Americans' pension funds, which are invested often in corporate securities. Or it can be taken out of what would otherwise be available for compensation for the employees of the corporation. And we're doing this today in the name of a New Deal, which puzzles me greatly because the New Deal by its own metric of success failed. The New Deal said, our job is to put the country back to work, to cure the unemployment that fell upon the country when the stock market collapsed in 1929 in October. The problem is unemployment in the United States was higher in 1939, much higher in 1939 than it was in 1931. The New Deal did not put the country back to work. World War II did, and the gearing up to be the arsenal of democracy. I've gone over a lot of things quickly because I want to leave you with this understanding. We are, I think, arguing about whether or not we should have a government-centered or a market-centered society. I think part of American exceptionalism, and this is the essence of conservatism, is that we are exceptional, is this. We're an exceptional country because we were born free, that is, without a feudal past, without an established church. We had an exceptional revolution, one that did not say we're going to deliver happiness, but that we're going to set you free to pursue happiness on your own as you define it for yourself. Third, we have an exceptional constitution, one that does not say what the government must do for us, but one that says what the government may not do to us. Now, conservatives are sometimes, well, a bit gloomy. Well, that's because I think we have a lively understanding of how much can go wrong in society, how perishable republics have proven from Rome to our day. Therefore, conservatism preaches an intelligent pessimism, not fatalism, but pessimism, not resignation, but a wariness about things that can go wrong. Abraham Lincoln famously spoke about the silent artillery of time, which can bring down nations and institutions. In 1776, two great books were published in that resonant year. One was Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, a happy, optimistic view of the fecundity of freedom. But another was the first volume of Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, a decline and fall that the American founders studied with intense care. Now, Winston Churchill, who loved our country as much as he loved his American mother, famously said, "The American people invariably do the right thing after they have exhausted all the alternatives." Well, I think we're pretty far down the list, but I do think that the American people retain certain basic conservative instincts. One is that a benevolent government is not always a real benefactor. I think they, as conservatives, think as Ronald Reagan did when he said, "I do not want to go back to the past. I want to go back to the past's way of facing the future." I would close simply by saying, as Lincoln did when he giving a talk in 1859 with the Civil War approaching. He gave the talk to the Wisconsin State Fair, and he told the story of the Oriental despot who summoned his wise men and gave them an assignment. He said, "Go away and come back with a proposition to be carved in stone, to be forever in view and forever true." They returned a few weeks later, and the proposition they had was, "This too shall pass away." Lincoln said, "How chastening in times of pride, how consoling in times of grief those words are, but let us hope that if we Americans cultivate the moral and intellectual world within us as assiduously and prodigiously as we cultivate the physical world around us, that we shall long endure," to use some language from the Gettysburg Address. Well, we have so far, and I think the cultivation of the moral and intellectual world within us that on the evidence I have in my office from Gettysburg College, you're doing your part. And on that note, I shall subside, and I welcome your questions about anything at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Will. I have a question for you. You began your talk discussing Federalist 10. I'm curious what you think Madison might say about today's party politics. In Federalist 10, he said, "Let the factions have at it, and it will lead to deliberation and compromise." Given the tribal nature of the current state of politics, I'm curious what you think he would say. Do you think that his logic in Fed 10 still holds water?
It's compromised by the emergence of parties, to which, by the way, he was a contributor. He and Jefferson went on their famous botanizing tour. It was really not botanizing at all. It was to organize what became the Democratic Party, which to this day is world's oldest and most successful political party. I think Madison would say that party loyalty combined with the comprehensive interventionist nature of government, producing dependent factions on the government, which Franklin Roosevelt perfected: labor, the elderly with Social Security, farm programs. He was a genius at producing factions dependent on the government. I think Madison would say that this has undermined the wholesome rivalrous equilibrium between our institutions. What we do about it, I do not know. I think confining the presidency, getting it back to a human dimension, restoring congressional supremacy, which I favor. Congress is, I think, Article 1 of the Constitution for a reason. The Article 2, which deals with the executive branch, the presidency, is very spare. It says the president shall take care that the laws are faithfully executed, period. That's a little more to it than that, but that's the essence. It's reactive. Congress acts, the president reacts. That is very much my view, that Madison would be dismayed.
Thank you. And with that, we're going to send it over to Emma Love. She's a Fielding Fellow and a member of the class of 2022 with the remainder of the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Will, for that wonderful talk that you just gave. I will be moderating the Q&A portion of tonight's program. I'm going to start off by going through the questions that we already have, and you can still send them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. There's a lot of questions, but we're going to try our best to get through them all. Now, to start off, do you think that conservatism, as you describe it, is misunderstood? And if so, what should change in our political discourse?
Well, conservatism, A, is misunderstood, partly because it's been hijacked by the 45th president, who calls himself a conservative, and I think is not a conservative in a meaningful sense. His conservative policies were those of any any Republican would have adopted, cutting corporate taxes, which, by the way, Barack Obama wanted to do, and appointing Federalist Society judges and all that. But conservatism now has been identified with a kind of crudeness, bad manners, presidential swagger. So in that sense, it's misunderstood. In another sense, conservatism is understood, and people are wary of it because it preaches scarcity, it preaches realism, it preaches the fact that we can't have everything we want. The first rule of economics is scarcity is real. The first rule of politics is ignore the first rule of economics. And so conservatism is, on the one hand, misrepresented by some of its so-called spokesmen these days, but on the other hand, conservatism is too well understood by people who understand its realism, its rigors, and its astringency.
Thank you. Here's another one. Mr. Well, I see that you wrote a very respectful and powerful tribute in recognition of the late Senator Bob Dole. What about Senator Dole did you most respect? What, as a young conservative and an American, should we take away from his touted career?
Well, he was a senator. That is, he took the legislative branch seriously. Most senators, or an awful lot of senators, when they put their makeup on or shave in the morning, look in the mirror and see a president, and they really want to get out of the Senate. Bob Dole tried to get out of the Senate, tried to be a president, but frankly, it served the country well that he stayed in the Senate because he took it seriously. And he took, therefore, bargaining seriously, legislative negotiating seriously. He took legislative friendships seriously. You may have seen President Biden's remarks in the rotunda today by Senator Dole's caskets. He said, when people criticized Biden, who was commuting back and forth every day between Washington and his home in Delaware for subsidizing Amtrak, Dole said, good Lord, no, let's subsidize Amtrak and keep going, because if Biden's here overnight, he'll do more damage. A kind of good joke from Biden, representing a time of good-natured civility that I hope will be back.
And in speaking with President Biden, in one of your interviews, you mentioned that because you stopped being a Republican does not mean that you stopped being a conservative. That you were voting for Biden in order to get some type of normalcy in the political system. As a political commentator, do you believe he is achieving normalcy? And if not, do you regret your vote?
I don't regret my vote, but I regret that he's not behaving as I hoped he would. Only 1/3 of those who participated in the Democratic nominating process in 2020 voted for Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Which means 2/3 of the voters essentially said, we don't want that. We want normalcy. We don't want transformation. We don't want refounding America. We don't want everything that the president, for reasons I do not understand, has decided to do. When Roosevelt fundamentally rearranged the relationship between the citizen and the central government beginning in 1933, he did it after a landslide victory in 1932. When Lyndon Johnson set out to, as he saw it, complete the New Deal project with the Great Society programs in 1965, he did it after a landslide victory over, I must say ruefully, the man for whom I cast my first presidential vote, Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. Joe Biden, with slender majorities, Thomas Jefferson warned in a letter, do not undertake great things on slender majorities, has, I think, fundamentally misread what the country wanted. The country wanted normality and calm after the Trump years. And I don't think they've got it, which is one reason why Mr. Biden's approval ratings are not good.
Another question we have here is, what do you say to the young conservatives who want to combat Trump's populism and his overall influence in the Republican Party?
To the conservatives who want to combat that?
Yeah, and I'm specifically referring to young conservatives, college students who, are watching this happening to, the Republican Party.
I say, have at it. I say, call Amazon and get a copy of my book, The Conservative Sensibility. Read it. It's 565 pages of text, I regret to tell you, but get principles and say we're not a cult of personality, the conservative movement. We are about ideas. Ideas have consequences. Indeed, I think only ideas have large and lasting consequences. And as a great conservative, Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, said, first you win the argument, then you win the vote. So we have young conservatives who want to take back the party from this cult of personality and the name calling and lying and all the rest. Have at it. It's your job. It's your generation that's going to inherit this mess.
And also about your book, Conservative Sensibility, we have someone who read your book and they found it very informative. They say, I agree with many of your observations, including your criticisms of large government's role. To that end, you cite Woodrow Wilson, the son of a Protestant clergyman. You state the premise of Christian theology is that we are fallen creatures who either do not know what we want or want the wrong things, and hence need to be governed by moral auditors. You attribute this to the progressives. How do you square this with the religious right, who advocate that same moral authority to support constraints on liberty and advocate a Christian theocracy?
There is a movement in America today. Person who poses that question is quite right. There are people that some of them call themselves integralists who believe that American culture is so fallen, so broken, so corrupt that the government must take charge and supervise the moral reconstruction of America. To this, I say two things. First, have you watched the government recently? I mean, the government is really not a convincing moral auditor. The government has very important functions in life. That's not one of them. Real conservatives say that it is the little platoons in life, beginning with the family, but civic organizations and all the rest, that do the moral work of society. Government should fill the potholes, deliver the mail, defend the shores, and get out of the way of creative people. The idea that I'm not doubting, I'm not questioning the reality of a coarseness in American culture. I talked about some of our cultural problems during my remarks, but I do not think that saying we need a powerful government to be our moral auditor and moral tutor. I think that the lessons of history is that is a recipe for unhappiness.
In today's political discourse, it seems like we have this very strict binary of Republicans and Republican and Democratic opinions. What do you believe should be the role of moderates and libertarians in the U.S. political sphere?
Well, I'm certainly on the libertarian side of things. Now, I'm not for legalizing cocaine and some of the other wilder shores of libertarianism, but I'm a libertarian in this sense. I think before the government interferes with the freedom of an individual or of two or more individuals cooperating voluntarily together, before it interferes with that, it ought to have a really good reason and it ought to say so clearly. That's the essence of libertarianism, moderate libertarianism. And it seems to me that if we take that seriously, and we take Pat Moynihan's admonition that everyone in America is entitled to his or her own opinion, but not his or her own facts. And if we take seriously Pat Moynihan's dictum that social science tells us not what to do, but what the results of what we're doing, then we'll have a fact-based, inherently temperate, powerful conservatism that respects facts and respects people who disagree with us.
Thank you. And now we only have time for one more question.
Let's take two more. Let's say
two
three.
more?
This is fun. Let's keep going.
We just want to respect everybody's time as well as your time, Mr. Will. Let's see. I think, how about this one? I was wondering on what your perspective is on the future of our democracy, given the apparent lack of a moral compass of such a large portion of our elected leadership.
I think the country is healthier than it seems. Now, I know that sounds a little bit like Mark Twain saying Wagner's music is better than it sounds, but let me explain. There are 331 million people in this country. At any given moment, about 325 million of them are not watching cable television and are not listening to talk radio rants. They're raising children, doing their jobs, and getting on with life. The American people are not angry. The tone of America is disproportionately set by the people who watch cable television and the people who listen to talk radio. But the American people, I think, are hungry for some leader who says, okay, everybody, deep breath, unclench your fists, unclench your teeth, calm down, and look around. America is a stunning success. We are a big country. We have big problems. We always have. So what? That's life. The fact is, people are fighting, risking and losing their lives in order to get into our country because they know it's still a land of hope and opportunity.
And you said you want to answer just one more question, and we have a fun one. Do you believe that there will be a 2022 MLB season? And if so, how long the season do you think it will be?
Oh, Lord. I've been through a lot of, I've done some work for Major League Baseball. I've been through a lot of these labor disputes. I tend to be pessimistic about this. I certainly hope there will be. I mean, I've been going to spring training in Arizona for more years than I count. So I hope so, but I wouldn't bet my net worth on it starting on time or spring training starting on time. It's an amazing game that we seem to somehow let the business side of it cloud the enjoyment of it, but let's hope so. And I don't know how many of you people are Phillies fans, but the National League East just got a lot more difficult because someone worth $14 billion now owns the Mets and owns Max Scherzer and owns Lindor and a lot of other things. So Phillies fans, stiffen your sinews and summon up the blood, as Shakespeare said, because you got a battle on your hands. Thank you, Gettysburg. I've enjoyed this.
Mr. Will, on behalf of Gettysburg College, the Eisenhower Institute, and the Fielding Center, we can't thank you enough for your time this evening. And thanks everyone for attending.